There is a war that has been fought continuously for over 70 years. A war without front lines, without uniforms, without a single bullet fired in anger. And yet, this war has toppled governments, destroyed economies, shattered alliances, and claimed countless lives, all without most Americans ever knowing it existed. It is fought in radio waves and printed pages, in whispered conversations and forged documents, in the minds of millions who never realized they were targets. This is the invisible war. While the world watched tanks roll through Europe and missiles point skyward during the Cold War, another conflict raged in the shadows, a battle for reality itself. Both superpowers deployed armies of psychologists, linguists, and intelligence operatives in a struggle to shape what people believed, how they thought, and ultimately what they would do. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the war you never saw, the secret campaigns, the manufactured realities, the invisible enemies that shaped the world we live in today. This is not history. This is happening right now. And you are already a participant, whether you know it or not. The year was 1947. World War II had ended, but a new conflict was already taking shape. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies against Nazi Germany, now faced each other across an ideological chasm that would define the next half-century. Traditional warfare between nuclear powers was unthinkable. The consequences were too catastrophic to contemplate, but the struggle for global influence could not simply cease. Would have to evolve. The battleground shifted from physical territory to something far more valuable: the human mind. In Washington, intelligence officials recognized that the Soviet Union had been perfecting psychological warfare techniques for decades. Lenin himself had understood that controlling information meant controlling populations. Stalin had elevated propaganda to an art form, reshaping Soviet society through relentless messaging and carefully constructed narratives. America needed to respond, but how do you fight a war of ideas? The answer came in the form of organizations that would become legendary in intelligence. Circles. The Office of Policy Coordination, established in 1948, became the covert action arm of American intelligence. Its mission was deliberately vague: to conduct propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, sabotage, demolition, and subversive activities. What this meant in practice was the creation of an entirely new kind of warfare. Radio Free Europe began broadcasting into Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe in 1950, beaming news, culture, and subtle anti-communist messaging to populations starved for outside information. Voice of America expanded its reach, becoming one of the most powerful broadcasting networks on Earth. But these were the visible components, the tip of a massive iceberg. Beneath the surface, American intelligence agencies were developing far more sophisticated tools. Operation Mockingbird recruited journalists at major American publications to plant stories favorable to U.S. interests. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, ostensibly an organization of anti-communist intellectuals, was secretly funded by the CIA to promote Western cultural values. The Soviets responded in kind. Department A of the KGB, its Active Measures Division, launched operations designed to undermine Western institutions, sow discord between NATO allies, and spread disinformation that would take decades to fully unravel. This was not merely propaganda in the traditional sense. This was something new: the systematic manipulation of reality on a global scale. Both sides understood that in the nuclear age, the most powerful weapons were not bombs. They were beliefs. Control what people believe, and you control their actions without ever firing a shot. The invisible war had begun. To understand how invisible warfare works, you have to understand its fundamental principle. The best influence is influence the target never detects. Soviet planners called their approach active measures, activnaya meropryatия. American strategists developed parallel concepts under various classified programs. But the underlying logic was identical. The goal was not to convince people through open argument. The goal was to shape the information environment so completely that the desired conclusions seemed self-evident, as natural as breathing, as obvious as sunrise. This required infrastructure, networks of agents, front organizations, compliant media outlets, and academic institutions that could amplify chosen narratives while appearing entirely independent. The Soviets excelled at creating front organizations, peace councils, friendship societies, cultural exchange programs, all nominally independent, all secretly directed from Moscow. These organizations could mobilize protests, publish studies, and generate news coverage that served Soviet interests while maintaining plausible deniability. American operations took a different form but served similar purposes. The National Endowment for Democracy and various affiliated institutes provided funding to organizations, promoting democratic values, genuine goals perhaps, but also convenient cover for influence operations in contested regions. Both sides invested heavily in what intelligence professionals call disinformation or disinformation, the deliberate creation and spread of false information designed to deceive target audiences. The techniques were remarkably sophisticated. Forged documents would be planted with journalists known for insufficient fact-checking. The stories would spread through legitimate media, gaining credibility with each republication. By the time the forgery was exposed, if it ever was, the damage was done. The false narrative had become part of the accepted historical record. One of the most successful Soviet disinformation campaigns targeted American racial tensions. Throughout the Cold War, KGB operatives worked to exacerbate divisions within American society, funding extremist groups on both sides of the political spectrum, planting stories designed to inflame racial hatred, and promoting narratives that portrayed American democracy as fundamentally hypocritical. Documents released after the Soviet collapse revealed operations specifically designed to undermine civil rights leaders, discredit American institutions, and create the perception of a nation tearing itself apart. The Americans, meanwhile, conducted parallel operations in the Soviet bloc. Underground literature was smuggled across borders. Defectors were debriefed and their stories amplified. Cultural products, jazz music, Hollywood films, blue jeans became weapons in a struggle for hearts and minds. Neither side was innocent. Both engaged in deception, manipulation, and the systematic distortion of truth in service of geopolitical objectives. The invisible war corrupted everything it touched. In 1983, a remarkable document surfaced in an Indian newspaper, claimed that the AIDS virus had been deliberately created in American military laboratories as a biological weapon, designed to target specific populations. The story spread rapidly through the developing world. It was republished in newspapers across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was cited by government officials, repeated by activists, and became accepted truth for millions of people. It was also completely false, a KGB disinformation operation codenamed Operation Infection. Soviet intelligence had identified an opportunity. AIDS was new, terrifying, and poorly understood. American explanations were incomplete, breeding suspicion. Into this information vacuum, the KGB inserted a carefully crafted lie. The operation was devastating in its effectiveness. Decades later, long after the Soviet Union collapsed, the conspiracy theory persists. It has contributed to vaccine hesitancy, distrust of Western medicine, and public health failures that have cost untold lives. This is the enduring power of disinformation. Truth can be established in hours. Lies can persist for generations. American operations were equally consequential, if sometimes differently structured. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup against the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Central to this operation was a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign. A fake radio station broadcast fabricated news of a massive invasion force. Leaflets were dropped over the capital, Rumors were spread through carefully cultivated networks. The actual military force involved was minimal, a few hundred poorly trained rebels. But the psychological operation created the perception of overwhelming strength. Government forces, believing they were hopelessly outmatched, collapsed. Armies fled. A government fell not because of military defeat, but because of manufactured belief. Similar operations followed in Iran, where the CIA helped overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1953, in Chile, where American intelligence worked to destabilize Salvador Allende's government, in countless other nations where the invisible war determined the fate of millions. The human cost of these operations is incalculable. Governments installed through covert action often proved brutal and corrupt. The backlash against perceived American manipulation fueled anti-Western movements for decades. Societies were scarred in ways that persist to this day. But the operations continued because they worked. In the calculus of Cold War strategists, shaping foreign governments through psychological operations was preferable to direct military intervention. The costs were hidden, the connections were deniable, and the results were often achieved without American casualties. This was the invisible war's terrible efficiency. It achieved its objectives while hiding its methods and its consequences from public view. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. American leaders proclaimed the triumph of democracy and the end of ideological conflict. But the invisible war never stopped. It simply evolved. The techniques perfected during decades of superpower competition did not disappear. They were adopted, adapted, and amplified by new actors with new capabilities. And the emergence of the Internet created a battlefield that Cold War strategists could scarcely have imagined. In the old paradigm, influence operations required extensive infrastructure, printing presses, radio transmitters, networks of agents, and front organizations. Reaching mass audiences was expensive and logistically complex. The digital revolution changed everything. Suddenly, anyone with an internet connection could reach millions of people instantly. Social media platforms created unprecedented opportunities for message amplification. Algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, proved remarkably susceptible to manipulation by those who understood their mechanics. The invisible enemy adapted faster than democratic institutions could respond. Russia, inheritor of Soviet intelligence traditions, recognized the potential immediately. Beginning in the early 2010s, Russian operatives began experimenting with social media manipulation on a massive scale. The Internet Research Agency, a St. Petersburg organization with direct ties to the Kremlin, deployed hundreds of operatives to create fake personas, generate divisive content, and amplify existing tensions within Western societies. The 2016 American presidential election became ground zero for this new phase of invisible warfare. Russian operatives created fake American identities by the thousands. They established Facebook groups promoting contradictory causes, Black Lives Matter pages and Blue Lives Matter pages, both designed not to advance either cause but to inflame division. They organized real-world protests, with Americans unwittingly attending events orchestrated by foreign intelligence. The sophistication was remarkable. The operatives studied American culture, mimicked American speech patterns, and identified the precise fault lines most susceptible to exploitation. They understood that the goal was not to support any particular candidate or party, it was to undermine faith in democratic institutions themselves. China developed parallel capabilities, though with different emphases. Chinese influence operations focused more heavily on shaping narratives about Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. They targeted diaspora communities, academic institutions, and media organizations that covered Chinese affairs. Iran, North Korea, and numerous non-state actors joined the fray, each pursuing their own objectives through the new tools of invisible warfare. But perhaps the most troubling development was the domestication of these techniques. Political operatives within democratic societies began adopting the methods pioneered by foreign intelligence services. Disinformation was no longer exclusively a foreign threat, it had become a domestic industry. Partisan media ecosystems emerged that bore disturbing resemblance to Cold War propaganda operations, complete with manufactured outrage, coordinated messaging, and systematic reality distortion. The invisible war had come home. We stand now at a crossroads that the architects of Cold War psychological operations could never have anticipated. The techniques they developed to wage invisible war against foreign adversaries have been turned inward. The information environment that shapes what Americans believe about their own country, their own institutions, and their own neighbors has become a contested battlefield. Foreign adversaries continue their operations, now enhanced by artificial intelligence and increasingly sophisticated targeting. But domestic actors have proven equally adept at manipulation and equally indifferent to truth. The result is an epistemological crisis without precedent in American history. Millions of citizens now inhabit entirely separate information realities. Facts accepted as obvious by one group are rejected as fabrications by another. Shared understanding, the foundation of democratic deliberation, has become increasingly elusive. This is not accidental. This is the intended outcome of invisible warfare. The goal was never to convince everyone of a particular position, it was to make agreement impossible, to fracture societies into mutually hostile camps incapable of collective action. By that measure, the invisible war has been devastatingly successful. But the story does not have to end here. Understanding the architecture of influence is the first step toward resisting it. Recognizing manipulation when it occurs, learning to identify the emotional triggers and divisive narratives that invisible warriors deploy, creates a form of immunity. The soldiers of the invisible war depend on targets who don't know they're being targeted. They rely on audiences who consume information passively, who share without verification, who allow outrage to overwhelm critical thinking. Awareness is the antidote. The war you never saw has shaped the world you live in. It has influenced elections, destroyed careers, ended lives, and reshaped entire societies. It continues at this very moment in the information streams you navigate daily, in the beliefs you hold, in the divisions that fracture your communities. You cannot opt out of this war. You are already a participant, as target, as vector, as potential casualty. But you can choose to fight back. You can choose to verify before sharing, to question emotional manipulation, to recognize that the invisible enemy's greatest weapon is your own willingness to believe what confirms your existing views. The Cold War ended 30 years ago, but the invisible war it spawned has never been more intense, more sophisticated, or more dangerous than it is today. The only question that remains is whether we will finally see it for what it is, before it's too late to do anything about it. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one you can see across a battlefield. It's the one that has already reshaped how you see the world, without you ever knowing it was there.